Picture a house with 70 rooms and only one door you're allowed to use. Now fill it with children who are never allowed to cry loudly enough for the street to hear, a queen who counts the household linen herself because she does not trust anyone else to get the number right, and a king who by daylight seems like the gentlest man in England, and by certain nights, years from now, will not be the same man at all. That is the Queen's House on the western edge of St. James's Park in the 1770s. Not a palace, not officially. A private house, bought for privacy, and privacy in a house this size means something you will spend years learning. That everyone who works inside these walls is being watched by everyone else who works inside these walls, all of them pretending not to watch at all. You are 7 months into this position, and you already know the rule that matters more than any other. You do not repeat what you see, not to your mother in her letters, not to the footman who flirts with you by the scullery door, not even, God forbid, to yourself in the quiet of the servants' attic, when you're turning something over in your mind and wondering if it means what you think it means. The rule was explained to you on your first morning by the woman who trained you, a stiff, thin-lipped wardrobe woman named Mrs. Kettle, who took your chin in her hand, not gently, and said that this house eats girls who talk. She did not say it as a threat exactly. She said it the way you would warn someone about a loose stair tread. Practical. Something you needed to know to keep from breaking your neck. You did not fully understand what she meant until the afternoon you found the letter. But that comes later. Tonight we start at the beginning, because you cannot understand what you found, or why it frightened you more than anything else into 11 years of service in that house, without first understanding what an ordinary day inside it actually felt like against your skin. Your name is Hetty Vane. You are 15 years old when you arrive, in the spring of 1773, sent up from a linen draper's family in Reading, because your aunt once did plain sewing for a lady's maid who knew a woman who knew the mistress of the robe's dresser. And in service, that is how doors open, through threads of acquaintance so thin you could snap them between 2 fingers, and yet somehow they hold. You bring 1 trunk, 2 shifts, a good gown you will not wear again for years because it is too fine for scullery work and too plain for anything else, a Bible your mother pressed into your hands at the coaching inn, with her mouth working like she wanted to say something and couldn't find it, and 11 shillings sewn into the hem of your petticoat because your father does not trust banks and trusts London even less. The coach drops you at the edge of the park before dawn, and you walk the last stretch on foot because that is what girls in your position do, dragging a trunk that is really too heavy for 1 person past the sleeping bulk of St. James's Palace with its old red brick until the trees open and you see it. It does not look the way you expected a royal house to look. You expected towers, turrets, something out of a woodcut. Instead, you get a plain, handsome block of pale stone, 3 stories, a curved colonnade of low buildings sweeping out on either side like arms, folding something private against its chest. It looks less like a palace, and more like what it actually is, a very large, very expensive private house that a duke built for himself 70 years ago, and a king bought because he wanted somewhere his wife could raise children without half of London watching her do it. You're shown in through a service door so far around the side that you nearly miss it, a narrow gap between kitchen wall and stable wall that smells immediately powerfully of horse dung, coal smoke, and boiling laundry starch. 3 smells so different from each other that your nose cannot decide which one to be alarmed by first. Underneath all of it, fainter, something green and growing, cut grass, wet earth, the specific smell of a garden being tended by men who are paid to make it look effortless. A housekeeper's assistant with red, chapped hands takes your letter of introduction, reads it without expression, and tells you to wait. You wait for 40 minutes on a bench in a corridor that smells of beeswax polish, watching housemaids move past you at a half run, none of them looking at you directly, all of them looking at you completely, in the particular way servants assess a newcomer. How are you dressed? How do you hold your hands? Will you be trouble? When Mrs. Kettle finally comes for you, she does not introduce herself. She simply says, "Vane." And when you stand, she turns and walks, expecting you to follow, which you do, half running to keep pace, your trunk abandoned on the bench for someone else to deal with later. She takes you through a service passage so narrow your shoulders nearly brush both walls, up a back stair worn concave in the middle of each tread by generations of feet, and into a room that will be yours to work in for longer than you can imagine on this first frightened morning. The wardrobe workroom, a long chamber lined with presses and shelves smelling of lavender, camphor, and the particular dry paper smell of silk that has been folded and unfolded 10,000 times. "You sew," Mrs. Kettle says. It is not a question. Your aunt's letter said you sew. "Yes, ma'am. Plain work. Some fine, if I'm shown the pattern." You will be shown nothing twice. She looks you over once, the way you'd size a length of cloth for floors. Her Majesty does not tolerate slow hands or loose tongues. You will learn quickly which of those matters more. You will learn over the following weeks that this is not an exaggeration built for effect on a new girl's first morning. It is simply true. The Queen, a small, quick-moving German princess who arrived in England 17 years ago at 17 years old, speaking no English, married to a man she had never met, and built herself, brick by brick, into someone this entire household fears and, in its strange way, loves. The Queen notices everything. She counts. She remembers who was late to a fitting 11 months ago. She has, Mrs. Kettle tells you in your first week, without a flicker of humour, dismissed a laundress for gossiping about a lady-in-waiting's swollen ankles, and reinstated her a fortnight later when the woman's children were found to be starving, because the Queen is not cruel, only exact, and exactness in this house is treated the way Scripture is treated in a rectory, as the organising law beneath everything else. Your hands are cold on that first morning, cold enough that when Mrs. Kettle sets a length of white silk sarcenet in front of you and tells you to hem it, you have to press your fingers flat against your own thighs first, just to get feeling back into them before you can thread a needle. The workroom fire is small and set well back from the fabric, because sparks and silk do not belong in the same breath, and so you work cold for most of every winter you spend in this house, your fingertips cracking at the pads, your knuckles going stiff by the middle of the afternoon, and you learn to work through it the way you learn everything else in service. Not because anyone teaches you to, but because the alternative is worse. The seam you sew that first morning is not good enough. Mrs. Kettle takes it from your hands, holds it up to the window light, and without a word, without even a sigh, picks out every stitch with the point of her own needle and hands it back to you to do again. You do it again. It takes you 4 attempts before she nods, once, and moves on to inspecting someone else's work, and that single nod feels, absurdly, like the best thing that has happened to you since you left Reading. This is the first thing you learn about the house. You will spend 11 years of your life inside. It runs, underneath all its silk and gilt and formality, on the same unglamorous current every other great house runs on. Labour, endless, repetitive, exacting labour, performed by hands that ache by noon and are expected to keep working anyway, because somewhere above you, in rooms you will not enter for months, a queen is dressing for a drawing room, and the seam on her sleeve had better be invisible. The house itself has a history you learn in fragments, the way servants learn everything, sideways, between tasks from older women who like the sound of their own knowledge. It was built not for a king, but for a duke, a man named John Sheffield, Duke of Buckingham, who wanted something grand enough to rival the palaces of men with older titles, and finished it in 1705, and who was, by all accounts passed down in the housekeeper's room, insufferably proud of it. He carved a motto over the door about his own greatness, and filled the place with paintings of himself. He is dead nearly 50 years by the time you arrive, and his house passed through his family, until the young king, only 2 years married and wanting somewhere private for his new wife, bought it in 1762 for something over £21,000, a number the older servants repeat to newcomers the way Scripture gets repeated, with a kind of reverent disbelief, because £21,000 is not a sum any of you will see in your lifetimes, combined, all of you together. He bought it, the housekeeper's room agrees, because St. James's Palace across the park is old and dark and swarming with courtiers and ceremony, and the young queen, 17 years old and freshly arrived from a small German duchy, needed somewhere to simply live. So this became that. The Queen's House, everyone calls it, though officially it still bears the old Duke's name on some deeds somewhere. You will hear, more than once in your years there, a wistful comment from someone above stairs about how strange it is that a house built to trumpet one man's vanity became, instead, a nursery. Because that is what it is, more than anything else, a nursery. You arrive already knowing distantly the way anyone in England knows it, that the King and Queen have children. You do not yet understand what that means as a fact of daily household life until your first full week, when you are moved, briefly, as extra hands are needed everywhere in this house, and no one's assigned task stays fixed for long, into the nursery wing to help carry linen. The sound reaches you before the smell does, for once. Children's voices, several of them at once, pitched at that particular register that only very young children produce, half laughter and half complaint, echoing off high ceilings never designed to muffle noise. Then the smell, milk gone slightly sour, the sharp ammonia sting of soiled linen waiting for the wash, beeswax candles, and underneath it all, warm bread, because someone is always in this wing trying to coax a fussing child with a heel of bread and butter. There are, by the time you arrive in 1773, already 9 living royal children in this house, ranging from the eldest prince, a boy of 10 who you will only glimpse from a distance for years, down to an infant princess not yet a year old. 9 children is not the end of it. Before the Queen is finished, there will be 15 born to her, all but 2 of them here, in this house, in a chamber on the ground floor kept ready for exactly that purpose, with an army of physicians and rockers and wet nurses on permanent, paid standby for an event that might happen on any night of any year for the better part of 2 decades. You learn this fact and it rearranges something in your understanding of the place. You'd pictured vaguely a house of ceremony, powder and silk and formal bows. Instead, you're handed an armful of small linen shirts, told to sort them by size into presses that already hold 40 other small linen shirts, and sent to find where the second nursery maid keeps the pins, because a prince 3 years old has apparently decided this particular morning that he will not be dressed by anyone but her, and is currently refusing to be dressed by anyone at all. The nursery maid, a broad, unhurried woman named Susan Frere, who has worked in this house since before you were born, takes one look at your face, startled, a little wild-eyed at the noise, and laughs. First week? Yes. You'll get used to it. Or you won't, and you'll go work for some quiet old duchess somewhere who only wants 6 shifts pressed a week and doesn't mind if you sleep past 5. She scoops up the shirtless 3-year-old, who shrieks with what might be fury or might be delight, impossible to tell which, and pins him into his shirt with the brisk efficiency of someone who has done this exact task 10,000 times before. But you won't leave. Nobody leaves. Not really. You get inside a house like this and it gets its hooks in you. You do not understand what she means yet. You will, eventually, and by then it will already be true of you too. Your actual days, once you're settled properly into the wardrobe workroom under Mrs. Kettle, follow a shape that repeats itself with such consistency that within a month you can feel, by the particular ache in your shoulders or the particular slant of light through the workroom window, roughly what hour it is without needing a clock. You rise before 5 in a garret room shared with 2 other undermaids. The ceiling sloped so low you can only stand fully upright in the centre of the room. The water in the basin has, more mornings than not through the winter months, a skin of ice across it, and you break it with the flat of your hand and gasp at the shock of the cold water underneath, splashing your face fast because lingering only makes it worse. You dress in the dark, mostly by feel, stays, petticoat, gown, apron, cap. Fingers clumsy with cold, fastening hooks you cannot see by touch alone, a skill you did not have in Reading and now have without remembering learning it. Breakfast, such as it is, happens standing in the servants' hall. Bread, small beer, sometimes a scrape of butter if the housekeeper is feeling generous that week. Eaten quickly, because the workroom opens at 6 and Mrs. Kettle does not care that your bread is only half chewed. The work itself is unglamorous in a way you had not expected of a royal household. You mend, you hem, you turn collars that have worn thin on the inside edge so the good side faces out again. You press linen with heated irons that you test against your own wrist first. A small burn risked deliberately every single time to avoid a larger one. The iron's weight dragging at your forearm until the muscle burns in a low, steady way you stop noticing by midday and feel, again, sharply, every night. You pick out old embroidery thread by thread when a gown is to be reworked for a different season, your eyes straining in whatever light the workroom windows give you, because candles near silk are forbidden except after dark, and after dark you're usually too tired to see the stitches anyway. Your hands change first. Within 2 months, your fingertips have hardened into something closer to leather than skin, calloused along the pad of your forefinger where the needle rides, and there is a permanent groove worn into the side of your middle finger from the thimble you wear so constantly you forget, sometimes, that it is there at all until you go to pick something up and feel its unfamiliar weight against your own skin, bare, on your 1/2 day off a month. What surprises you most in those first months is the king himself. You expected, everyone expects coming into this house from outside it, grandeur. A man who moves through rooms trailing consequence the way a comet trails light. What you get instead, the first time you actually see him at close range, is a tall, fair, faintly awkward man in a plain brown coat, walking briskly through the garden with 2 spaniels at his heels, stopping every few paces to examine a plant, murmuring something to the head gardener about a bed of tulips that have come up wrong, entirely absorbed for that moment in tulips. He likes, you learn, farming. He likes clocks and the mechanisms inside them, taking them apart on his own writing table and putting them back together, a habit that makes the housekeeper's room roll its eyes fondly, the way you might discuss an endearing eccentricity in an uncle. He likes his library, a vast, still-growing collection of books that by now numbers in the tens of thousands, housed in rooms built specially to hold them. And it is in this library, more than the state apartments at St. James's, more than anywhere else in either house, that you eventually come to understand where the real king lives. Not the ceremonial figure who appears at drawing rooms in ermine and blue ribbon, but a plain, curious, restless man who would rather be reading about crop rotation than receiving ambassadors. He rises early, earlier than most of the household, which means the king is often already awake and dressed, and at his desk by the time the underservants are lighting the kitchen fires. He eats simply: mutton, plain vegetables, small quantities of wine, none of the excess you might expect of a king, and you hear, more than once, an undercook grumbling good-naturedly that His Majesty's frugality is bad for a cook's reputation, because there is no glory in preparing boiled mutton for a monarch who would honestly prefer bread and cheese. The Queen matches him in this. She rises early too. He is at her correspondence by 7 most mornings, writing in German to her family and in careful, still slightly accented English to everyone else. And she has, Mrs. Kettle informs you with the closest thing to approval you ever hear in her voice. No patience whatsoever for waste. Candle ends are saved. Old gowns are not thrown away but reworked, taken apart and remade into something else, which is, you come to realise with some bitterness during a long week, spent unpicking a court gown's entire skirt by hand, precisely why your fingers ache the way they do. She has, too, a passion that seems strange to you at first for a queen. Plants, gardens, the careful cultivation of things that grow. She corresponds about botany. She has helped build, at the King's Country Retreat a few miles upriver, gardens that are already becoming famous for the sheer range of plants gathered there from every corner of a world England's ships now reach into. And when she visits that other house, she comes back with cuttings, with pressed specimens, with an energy in her step that you do not see when she returns from a formal court occasion. You begin slowly to understand something about this family that the outside world you suspect does not entirely grasp. From the street, from the newspapers, from the engravings sold in print shop windows, this is a royal family, remote, ceremonial, gilded. From inside it is something stranger and smaller, a domestic household run with the exacting frugality of a prosperous merchant family that happens 2 or 3 times a week to put on ermine and hold court. Your first drawing room comes in your 4th month, though you do not attend it. Servants of your rank do not attend anything. You exist entirely in its margins. But you are part of the machinery that produces it, and that machinery starts 3 days before the event itself. The Queen's gown for the occasion has been chosen, a hooped court dress in deep blue silk, embroidered with silver thread, and it is your workroom's task to see that every inch of it is perfect. You spend 2 full days on nothing but the underskirt, checking every seam by candlelight after dark despite the danger, because the gown must be ready by morning, and there are simply not enough daylight hours left. Your eyes burn. Your neck aches from bending over the same 6 inches of fabric for so long that when you finally straighten, the room tilts slightly, and Mrs. Kettle, without looking up from her own work, tells you to walk to the window and look at something far away for a moment before you go blind stitching that hem crooked. On the morning of the drawing room itself, you are one of 6 pairs of hands dressing the Queen, not touching her directly. Your rank does not permit that, but holding pins, fetching, adjusting the hoop's understructure while the senior dressers do the actual work of lacing and arranging. The Queen stands very still through all of it, patient in a way that surprises you, occasionally murmuring an instruction in her accented English, once reaching down without warning to adjust a fold of fabric herself, her own fingers quick and sure, because she was, before any of this, a girl who was taught needlework same as you were. You catch, in that one close moment, the smell of her. Orange flower water and something underneath it, warm and simply human, sweat controlled but not entirely erased by scent, and it startles you, faintly, to realize that a queen sweats in her stays same as anyone laced too tight for comfort. By the time she descends the great stair 2 hours later, in the finished gown, jewels at her throat, the whole effect assembled from 3 days of your aching hands and 40 other pairs of hands besides, she looks like something out of an engraving, untouchable, perfect. You know better. You know exactly how many stitches hold that perfection together, and how many of them are yours. Below stairs, the household sorts itself into a hierarchy as rigid as anything above it, and you learn its rules quickly because the alternative is humiliation you will not forget. The housekeeper sits at the top of the women's side, answerable directly to the Queen's own senior ladies. Beneath her, the wardrobe women, the still-room maids, the laundry maids, the nursery maids, each group with its own territory and its own particular contempt for the groups it considers beneath it. Laundry maids are looked down upon by wardrobe women for the coarseness of their work, though it is, you come to think privately, the hardest labour in the entire house, and you never once say this thought aloud, because saying it aloud would mark you as someone with opinions above her station. You're sent to help in the laundry only once, during a week when a fever runs through the wash-house, and half its usual hands are down with it, and that single week teaches you more about your own body's limits than the previous 4 months combined. The wash-house sits apart from the main building, a low brick structure near the stables, and you smell it from 30 yards away. Hot soap fat, wet ash from the lye, and steam so thick it beads on the ceiling and drops back down onto your neck in fat, warm droplets that make you flinch every time, no matter how many times it happens. The work itself is brutal in a way sewing never is. You haul water, bucket after bucket from the pump, your shoulders screaming by the 10th trip, the bucket's wire handle biting a groove into your palm that will blister by noon and harden by the following week. You feed linen into the great copper vat, stirring it with a wooden dolly stick as thick as your wrist, the steam rising into your face until your own sweat and the wash-house's steam become indistinguishable, soaking your shift through under your apron. You wring sheets by hand, twisting them between 2 of you, arms shaking with the effort, water running down to your elbows and dripping off in a steady patter onto the flagstone floor already slick with it. By the end of the first day your hands are raw, not blistered exactly, but stripped, the skin gone soft and wrinkled and strangely tender from hours in hot water and harsh soap, and that night, lying in your garret bed, you cannot make a proper fist without wincing. "First laundry week," says the woman working the mangle beside you, A broad-armed veteran named Joan, who has clearly done this every week of her working life and has the forearms to prove it. She does not wait for your answer. Rub goose grease into them tonight, every night this week. It'll crack less. You do, and it helps marginally, and you file the advice away the way you file away everything useful that older women tell you in this house. Because nobody above stairs is going to teach you how to survive it, and the women beside you are the only education you will get. It is Joan, in fact, who becomes something like a teacher to you over your years in the house, though neither of you would ever call it that. She has worked in service since she was 9 years old, has buried 2 children and a husband, and speaks about the royal family with a mixture of loyalty and clear-eyed skepticism that unsettles you at first and comes to feel, eventually, like the only honest way to think about the people you serve. "They're kind as such folk go," she tells you once, wringing a sheet with hands like knotted rope. "Kinder than most. The Queen remembers your name, which is more than you'll get from half the houses in this city. But don't you go loving them, girl. Don't you go thinking they'd weep for you the way you'd weep for them. You're linen to them. Good linen, maybe. Cared for linen, but linen." You think about this for a long time afterward. You're not sure, even years later, whether you agree with her entirely, but you never forget it. The seasons turn around you the way they turn around everyone in service, marked less by weather than by what the work demands. Spring means the great airing of winter furnishings, every hanging and curtain in the staterooms taken down, beaten, aired, and rehung, a task that leaves the air thick with dust for a week and has you sneezing through every meal. Summer means the heat rising unbearably in the upper workrooms, where you sit near windows that cannot be opened wide because street noise disturbs the Queen's correspondence below, sweat running down your spine under your stays until your shift is soaked through by midday. Autumn brings the great store of linen for winter, sorting and marking and mending against the cold months ahead. And winter itself brings the cold you already know, the ice in the wash basin, the fires kept small and careful everywhere except the nursery, where the youngest children are never under any circumstances allowed to feel a chill. You come to know the library too, though not the way you expected. Not as a place you are permitted to browse. You're not. Your hands are not clean enough for that. Your rank does not extend that far. But as a place you clean, early, before the king rises, moving quietly between shelves that reach 3 times your own height, dusting spines with the soft cloth, careful never to disturb the order the king himself insists on, because he knows, apparently, exactly where every one of these tens of thousands of volumes sits, and a book returned to the wrong shelf is noticed, and remarked upon, and mildly, courteously corrected. You like this task more than almost any other. There is something in the sheer scale of it. Floor to ceiling, room after room, a private ocean of paper that this one restless, curious man has assembled, seemingly out of pure appetite for knowing things, that makes the rest of the house feel smaller by comparison, and makes you feel standing alone in the grey early light with a duster in your hand, unexpectedly close to something you cannot quite name. Not grandeur, something more like the presence of a mind that never stops working, still faintly warm in the room the way a hearth stays warm after the fire's gone out. One morning, dusting the high shelves in the second library room, you find him already there. You freeze. You're not meant to be in this room while he is in it. The schedule you were given specifically avoids this. But there he is, in his dressing gown, standing at the window with a book open in one hand, not reading it, simply holding it, looking out at the park where the mist has not yet burned off the grass. You drop into the deepest curtsy you can manage and stay there, staring at the floor, praying he will simply not notice you, or notice you and say nothing, or, "You needn't stop your work on my account," he says without turning from the window. His voice is mild, a little quick, faintly accented in the particular way of a man who's raised speaking German in the nursery before English took over. "Dust away, I shan't mind the noise of it." You do not know what to say. You murmur something, "Yes, sir, thank you, sir," and go back to your duster with hands that are not entirely steady, and he goes back to his window, and for perhaps 10 minutes the two of you occupy the same room in complete, companionable silence. A king and a 15-year-old maid, both of them, in their different ways, simply attending to the day in front of them. It is the closest you will come to speaking with him for the next 12 years. You hear, over those same early years, a nickname for him that the ordinary people of London have taken to using, half fond and half mocking, the way crowds always take some private truth about a great person and turn it into something they can shout cheaply in the street. Farmer George. It comes, you learn, from his habit of riding out to inspect model farms he has established, correspond under an assumed name with agricultural journals about the proper rotation of turnips, personally overseeing the breeding of a small flock of merino sheep imported at considerable trouble and expense, because he is convinced, against the advice of men who claim to know better, that English wool could be finer than it currently is, if only someone bothered to improve the stock properly. You witness a small piece of this obsession first-hand in your 4th year, sent on an errand to the kitchen garden to fetch herbs for the still-room and finding the king himself there, coat off, sleeves pushed back, arguing amiably with the head gardener about the proper depth for a new bed of asparagus crowns. His own hands, a king's hands, black to the wrist with garden soil, entirely unconcerned that anyone might think it strange. "They tell me a king has no business with dirt under his nails," he says, apparently to no one in particular, though you suspect, catching the flicker of his eye toward you as you hurry past with your basket of herbs, that he knows perfectly well you can hear him. "I tell them a king who has never grown anything with his own hands has no business telling farmers how to feed a country." He laughs, a short, genuine sound, and goes back to his asparagus crowns. And you carry your herbs back to the still room, turning the exchange over in your mind, thinking that whatever this house's ceremonies and silks might suggest to the crowds gathered outside its gates, the man at its actual centre seems, more than anything else you have yet observed of him, to simply enjoy making things grow. By your 2nd year in the house, you've been moved. Permanently now, between the wardrobe workroom and the nursery wing, your hands trusted with more delicate work than you started with, and it is in this dual position that you witness, at close range, the event that dominates the household's rhythm more than any other, the arrival of a royal child. You have already lived through 2 of these by your 3rd year, but the one that stays with you clearest happens in the height of an August so hot that the wash-house steam feels almost like relief by comparison, when word runs through the servants' hall before dawn that Her Majesty's time has come. The house transforms within the hour. Doctors arrive by carriage, their wigs slightly askew from being roused too fast, hurrying up the front steps with the particular grim urgency of men who know their reputations ride on the next several hours going well. The chamber prepared for exactly this purpose, on the ground floor, has been kept in readiness for weeks. Clean linen stacked and waiting, a fire already laid, the specific implements of a physician's trade set out on a cloth, though what those implements are you do not see and would not understand if you did. Your task, along with 2 other maids, is linen, an endless grinding supply of it, boiled and pressed and carried up in relays through the hours that follow, because a birth in this era, even a royal one, even one attended by the finest physicians money and rank can produce, is a bloody, exhausting, dangerous business, and the linen goes through fast. You do not see the Queen herself during any of this. Your rank keeps you in the passage, in the linen store, in the kitchen where extra broth is being kept warm for hours on end in case it's needed. But you hear things, a cry, muffled by 2 closed doors and a long corridor that makes your own stomach clench in sympathy. The low, steady murmur of a physician's voice, once distinctly the sound of the king's own footsteps, quick and uneven, pacing a room somewhere above you, back and forth, for nearly 4 hours, because for all his composure in the library, for all his mildness with dusting maids, he is, on this day, simply a husband waiting to learn if his wife will live through the afternoon. She does. They almost always do in this house with these physicians, though you have heard, in low voices in the housekeeper's room, of royal households elsewhere where that has not been true, and you understand, without anyone spelling it out, that the money and care lavished on this one small woman's safety in childbed is not lavished on women like Joan the laundress, or on your own mother, who bore 6 children in a room above a linen draper's shop with no physician at all, only a neighbour woman and her own gritted teeth. The child, when the news finally comes down the back stair in a breathless rush, past maid to footman to groom, is a princess, healthy, loud-voiced already, and the relief that moves through the servants' hall is genuine, not performed loyalty, but real, human relief, because you have all, in your different ways, spent the day frightened for a woman you serve and rarely speak to, and somehow, despite everything Joan warned you about not loving them, have come to feel something for. That night, exhausted, your feet swollen from 12 hours of carrying linen up and down back stairs, you are given, along with the rest of the household staff, an extra half-pint of small beer and a slice of the kitchen's own celebratory cake, and you eat it standing in the scullery doorway looking out at the dark garden, and you think, not for the first time, that this house holds 2 entirely different lives inside its one set of walls, the gilded one above and the exhausted, aching, entirely ordinary one below, and that the space between them is thinner than either side likes to admit, thinner than a single flight of stairs, and yet somehow also uncrossable. There is one errand from those early years that stays with you longer than almost any single task inside the house itself, precisely because it takes you outside it, into a London the family's own carriages pass through daily, but never, you suspect, see in the way a maid on foot is forced to see it. Mrs. Kettle sends you in your second spring to a mercer's shop off the market near St. James's to collect a bolt of fine lawn ordered specially and not delivered on schedule, and the walk there takes you along streets that grow steadily poorer the further you move from the park's clean, ordered edges, until you find yourself picking your way past an open kennel, running foul down the centre of a lane, past a woman sitting in a doorway with 2 children pressed against her, none of the 3 of them, as far as you can tell, having eaten anything that morning, past a man missing most of one leg, propped against a wall with his hand out, silent, simply waiting. You give the man a halfpenny, one of the few coins you have on you, and he thanks you with a nod so brief and so worn with a habit of gratitude that you understand with a small cold jolt that this is not the first halfpenny he has been given today, nor will it be the last, nor will the sum of them, by evening, amount to anything close to enough. You think, walking on with your errand still uncompleted, of the nursery you left behind that morning. 9 children, soon to be more, never once in any danger of missing a meal, dressed in linen your own hands help keep spotless, attended day and night by an army of servants whose sole purpose is to ensure that no royal child ever knows real hunger or real cold. And you think of the woman in the doorway behind you, and the wordless, patient man with his hand out, existing at a distance from that nursery of perhaps 4 streets and an entire universe. You do not resolve this thought. You're not sure it can be resolved. Not by a wardrobe maid with a bolt of lawn to collect and a mistress who will want to know why you took so long about it. But you carry the woman's face and the man's silent, worn nod back through the park gates with you, past the neat gravel walks and the clipped hedges, and you find that the house looks, for the rest of that particular day, very slightly different to you than it did that morning. No less grand, but somehow more clearly, more uncomfortably, a single fortunate island in the middle of a much larger, much harder sea. You're 17 that year. By the time you're 20, you have earned enough trust to be given a permanent post as one of the senior wardrobe maids, answerable now not to Mrs. Kettle alone, but occasionally, briefly, directly to one of the Queen's own dressers, which means you sometimes stand near enough to the Queen herself to see the fine lines beginning at the corners of her eyes, to smell the specific soap she favours, to notice, once, with a small shock of ordinary human recognition, that her stockings have been darned at the heel, carefully and visibly, the same way you darn your own. Years pass the way years pass in service, not in dramatic leaps, but in the slow accumulation of 10,000 identical mornings, until one day you realize you have stopped counting how long you've been here, because the house's rhythm has become your own rhythm, indistinguishable from it. There is one afternoon, a Sunday or half-day, that you remember more clearly than almost any other single day of your service, not because anything eventful happens in it, but because of where you go and what you see from there. Susan Frere, the nursery maid who laughed at you your first week and has become, over the years, something closer to a friend than you expected to find in a house like this, takes you up onto the leads, the flat lead roofing above the state apartments, reached by a narrow service stair and a door that is technically not meant to be used for idle purposes, but that every senior servant in the house knows how to slip through unnoticed on a quiet Sunday. The wind up there is sharper than anything you feel at ground level, carrying coal smoke and river damp, and faintly the green smell of the park spread out below you. You stand at the parapet's edge, and for the first time in years of service you see your world from above rather than from within it, the house itself, its curved wings folding around the forecourt like the arms you noticed on your very first morning, now visible all at once from a height instead of piecemeal from inside. Beyond it, the park, green and orderly, with St. James's Palace's old red brick showing through the trees to the east, and beyond that, hazy and cold smoke, the whole vast sprawl of London itself, spires and rooftops stretching further than you can properly account for, the dome of a great cathedral rising pale above it all in the distance. That's the whole of it, Susan says, following your gaze. Or near enough. You can't see Whitechapel from here, nor the docks proper, but that's most of the city that matters, laid out like a plate at dinner. You think about how small this house looks from up here, this house that has felt from inside it, like the entire boundary of your world for years now. Every corridor memorized, every stair counted by feel in the dark, Every room's particular smell known to you, the way you know your own mother's kitchen. From up here it is one pale block among thousands, distinguished mainly by the quality of its garden and the flag that sometimes flies above it to mark that the family's in residence. "Do you ever think," you ask Susan, "about what it'd be to leave, to go somewhere none of this reaches?" She considers this for a long moment, the wind pulling at the edges of her cap. "Sometimes, less than I used to." She nods toward the house below them. "It gets its hooks in you, like I told you your first week. Not because it's grand, because it's yours, in a strange way that isn't really true and feels true anyway. You've raised half these royal children with your own 2 hands, same as me. Fed them, dressed them, wiped their noses when they cried. Nobody outside these walls will ever know it, but you'll know it. That's worth something, even if it's something you can't spend at market. You stand up there until the light starts to fail and the cold drives you back down through the narrow door, back into the world of corridors and candlelight and endless small tasks, and something about the view stays with you, the sense, newly gained, that the house which has swallowed your whole young life is, seen properly, only one small piece of a vast and busy world, and that you are, within that vast world, smaller still. And yet you go back down those stairs feeling, oddly, not diminished by the thought, but steadied by it. There is a kind of peace in understanding your own size correctly. It is nearly 2 years after that afternoon on the Leads that the first real crack appears in the world you've come to think of as unshakable, though you do not recognize it as crack at the time. It looks at first like nothing more than an ordinary alarm over almost before it begins. It happens not at the Queen's house, but across the park at St. James's Palace on an August afternoon in 1786, and you only learn of it second hand in the frantic, breathless account brought back by a footman who had accompanied the King's party that day, and returns white-faced and shaking to tell the story to a servants' hall gone utterly silent to hear it. The King had been stepping from his carriage, the footman says, at the garden entrance to St. James's. A crowd of the usual petitioners and onlookers gathered as they always do, when a woman, ordinary-looking, respectably dressed, nothing in her appearance to mark her as dangerous, pushed forward with a paper in her hand as though to present a petition, and instead produced a small knife and struck at the King's chest. The blade, by what the footman swears is nothing short of Providence, caught only in the King's waistcoat, doing no real harm at all. What happens next is the part that runs through the servants' hall like a current, told and retold over the following days until you could probably recite it yourself without ever having been there. The King, rather than recoiling or crying out, stepped back, raised his hand to stop the guards already moving to cut the woman down where she stood, and said, in a voice the footman swears was perfectly steady, that the poor woman was mad, and that she was not to be hurt. "Mad," the housekeeper repeats that evening, turning the word over with clear distaste, as though tasting something gone slightly off. Well, he'd know a soul in distress when he saw one, I suppose. Kinder to her than most men would have managed with a blade an inch from their heart. You think about this exchange again and again in the days that follow. The King's own words about the woman's madness, his instinct to protect rather than punish someone who had just tried to kill him, and you feel, without being able to name exactly why, a small, cold thread of unease running underneath the household's general relief that the King was unharmed. It is nothing you could explain to anyone. It simply sits there, quiet at the back of your mind, the way a splinter sits under skin too shallow to fully notice and too deep to easily forget. The household returns to its rhythms within the week. The incident becomes a story told at dinner tables across London. The king's mercy toward his own attacker praised in every newspaper that dares print an opinion on it, and life at the Queen's house resumes its old familiar shape. Mending, pressing, nursery linen, drawing rooms, the endless small labour of keeping this one large family clothed and fed and presentable to a world that watches it constantly and understands almost nothing of what actually happens inside these walls. You do not know it yet, standing in the wardrobe workroom 2 years later, with a needle between your fingers and the ordinary ache of an ordinary afternoon settling into your shoulders. But the thread of unease planted by that August afternoon has not gone anywhere at all. It has simply been waiting, the way a seed waits under frozen ground for conditions to change. Before that change comes, though, there are 2 more years of entirely ordinary life inside the house, and it is worth pausing inside them, because they are the years in which you come closest to understanding, in your own body, exactly how much danger sits quietly folded into work that looks, from outside, like nothing more than needlework and linen counting. The danger you fear most in the wardrobe workroom is not the one you would have guessed as a girl of 15, arriving with a Bible and 11 shillings sewn into her hem. It is not scandal or dismissal, or even the cold that cracks your knuckles every winter. It is fire. You learn to fear it properly in your 9th year of service. On an ordinary February evening when the light has already failed, and Mrs. Kettle has permitted grudgingly 2 candles to be lit at the far end of the workroom, so that a rush order of mourning creep for some minor foreign relations death, the details of which never quite reach the workroom, can be finished before morning. You're working nearest the candles because your eyes, at 24, are still sharper than the older women's, and it is you who first smells it. Not smoke exactly, not yet, but the particular hot, singed smell of something too close to flame that every servant in a great house learns to recognize in their sleep. A smell that raises the hair on your arms half a second before your conscious mind has even identified what it means. You turn, and there, at the end of the long cutting table, a length of black silk crepe draped for measurement has crept. Inch by inch has the fabric settled under its own weight, close enough to one guttering candle flame that its very edge has begun to smoke. A thin, curling grey thread rising from fibres not yet properly alight but seconds away from it. You do not scream. Screaming, you have learned in 9 years of service, wastes the half-second that matters most. You cross the room in 3 strides, snatch up the water jug kept, always, within reach of every lit candle in that workroom for exactly this reason, and douse the smoking fabric before the thread of smoke can become anything more than a thread. Your heart slamming so hard against your ribs that you can feel it in your own throat. Your hands, when you finally set the jug back down, shaking badly enough that you have to press them flat against the cutting table to still them. Mrs. Kettle is beside you within seconds, having heard the water jug's movement before she registered any danger at all, her own face gone pale and tight in the candlelight as she lifts the ruined corner of crepe, still faintly smoking, and turns it over in her hands, assessing the damage with the same clinical eye she once turned on your first crooked seam. "Good girl," she says, and it is the only time in 9 years you hear her say those 2 words together, and something in your chest, still hammering with the fright of it, loosens slightly at hearing them. The ruined length of crepe is a loss the household absorbs without much comment. Fabric can be replaced, and mourning crepe more easily than most, given how often, In a family this size and this exposed to a wide connected network of European relations, someone somewhere requires it. What cannot be so easily replaced, everyone in that workroom understands without saying it aloud, is a wooden house full of silk and candle wax and sleeping children. Should a fire of that kind ever be allowed the full half-minute it needs to take proper hold? You think of the great fire that swept through a duke's old palace decades before this one was even built. A story you heard early in your service from an older housemaid who liked to frighten you girls with it. Flames racing up hangings and through panelling faster than any bucket chain could match. Whole wings gone to ash within an hour, and though that fire happened in a different house entirely, in a different reign, the story does its intended work on you regardless. And for the rest of your years in that workroom you check, without needing to be told, the distance between every candle and every length of fabric within reach of it. A habit that outlives your service there by decades, following you into your own home with Thomas, where your grown children tease you gently for the whole of your life about your instinct to move a candle 6 inches further from a curtain the moment you enter any room at all. The other labour you remember most clearly from those 2 quiet years before the King's illness has nothing to do with silk or fire at all, and everything to do with ice. Every winter, when the cold has held hard enough for long enough, the household's ice house, a deep brick-lined pit sunk into the earth near the kitchen gardens, insulated with straw, built to hold frozen water through an entire summer of ordinary use, must be filled from whatever pond or stretch of the park's own ornamental water has frozen thick enough to bear the weight of men cutting it. It is not strictly wardrobe work, but in a hard winter every spare pair of hands in the household is pressed into service for it, because ice, once the thaw comes, cannot be gathered again until the following year, and a summer without it means spoiled meat and warm wine and a kitchen full of complaints that reach even the housekeeper's ears. You're sent out on one such morning in your 7th year, breath clouding in air so cold it feels solid in your lungs, to help carry the great sawn blocks from the pond's edge to the waiting cart, and the work is unlike anything else you do in that house all year. The ice itself, when you finally get your hands on a block hauled up from the pond by the men cutting it, is a shock of cold so total it feels less like temperature and more like a kind of burn, biting through your mittens within seconds no matter how tightly woven, and you learn quickly to shift your grip constantly, never holding any one spot too long, passing the weight hand to hand with the other maids in a chain that moves the blocks from pond's edge to cart bed in a rhythm that becomes, after the first hour, almost hypnotic in its repetition. Your arms ache in a way distinct from the ache of needlework, a deep muscular strain that settles into your shoulders and does not properly leave for 2 full days afterward. And your fingers, by the time the cart is finally loaded and the icehouse packed and strawed for the coming summer, have gone past cold into something closer to numb, a dull absence of feeling that frightens you slightly until Joan, working the chain a few places down from you, calls out over the general noise not to worry. That feeling always comes back within the hour once you're inside by a fire, and it does, arriving as a hot, prickling ache that is nearly as unpleasant as the cold itself. But at least, she assures you, means nothing worse has happened to your fingers than a good hard morning's work. You think, stamping your feet by the kitchen fire afterward, mug of hot small beer cupped in hand still faintly trembling with returning feeling, that this house has taught you more about the actual physical cost of comfort than any sermon you ever heard in Reading. every cold drink served at a summer drawing room, every dish of ice cream carried up on a silver tray to delight some visiting ambassador, rests on mornings exactly like this one. A chain of aching, half-frozen hands, passing blocks of pond water from a frozen morning into a straw-packed pit. Work that will never be seen, never be thanked, and never once be missing from the summer table it makes possible. It is around this same time, in the ordinary rhythm of those quiet years, that you come to know the youngest of the royal children more closely than you ever expected to. Through Susan's insistence that an extra pair of steady hands in the nursery is always welcome, whatever your official post says on paper, you help teach the smallest princesses their stitches, your own 11 years of hard-won needle skill passed down now to fingers barely strong enough to hold a needle steady, and you find, watching a 6-year-old princess frown in fierce concentration over a crooked hem exactly the way you once frowned over your own first crooked seam under Mrs. Kettle's unforgiving eye, that something in you has softened toward this whole strange, gilded, aching household in a way you did not expect when you arrived here at 15 with cold hands and 11 shillings and no intention of loving anyone inside these walls at all. The summer of 1788 arrives hot and close, the kind of London summer that turns the Thames sluggish and rank, and makes even the park's carefully tended grass look tired by August. And it is in the middle of that heat that you first hear the word unwell attached to the king in a tone that makes the back of your neck prickle. It starts small. A comment from one of the Queen's senior dressers passed to Mrs. Kettle in a low voice you are not meant to overhear while you sort a basket of stockings nearby. His Majesty's stomach troubling him again, a bilious complaint, nothing that a course of the waters won't settle. The royal party is to travel to Cheltenham, west of London, to take the spa waters there. A fashionable and entirely unremarkable remedy for a man who has always run himself hard and eaten too little, and slept too little, driving his own restless energy through days that would exhaust men half his age. You think nothing more of it. Kings get bilious complaints same as anyone, and the household's greater concern that week is the endless packing required to move a royal family and half its retinue. 2 days' journey west for 6 weeks of taking waters that smell. By every account you hear from servants who've travelled there before, distinctly of rotten eggs. The family returns from Cheltenham in the early autumn, and for a few weeks nothing seems amiss. But you notice things, the way anyone who has spent 15 years learning to read a household's moods without being told anything directly learns to notice things. The king's pace through the corridors, always quick, becomes quicker, almost frantic, as though he is trying to outrun something just behind his own shoulder. His talk, when you catch fragments of it passing an open door, comes faster too, tumbling over itself, subjects changing mid-sentence with no clear thread connecting one to the next. By late October, the word passed in the servants' hall has changed from unwell to something with a harder edge to it, spoken more quietly, glanced around before it's said. Confused. That is the word you hear first from Susan Frere, who has it from a footman who has it from a groom who was in the room, or near it, when the king, dressing for an evening, could not seem to find the end of his own sentence, repeating the same instruction to his valet 3 times without appearing to notice he'd already said it. You do not see any of this directly. Your rank keeps you in the wardrobe workroom, in the nursery wing, in the linen store, exactly as it always has. But the house itself begins to feel different around you, the way air feels different before a storm, a pressure you cannot name pressing down on every ordinary task, doors that are usually left ajar now kept closed. Footmen moving through corridors with their faces schooled into careful blankness. Physicians' carriages arriving at hours. No physician's carriage has ever arrived at this house before. The Queen's own manner changes first, and it is her change that frightens you more than any rumour from the servants' hall, because you see it yourself, directly, dressing her for what should be an ordinary morning in early November. Her hands, usually so quick and precise, fumble twice with a clasp she has fastened herself 1,000 times before. Her face, always composed even under strain, has gone pale and drawn, dark shadows pooling under eyes that look, when you catch them in the looking-glass by accident, entirely somewhere else, not in the room with you at all, but fixed on something happening 2 floors away that none of you can see. Her Majesty is not to be disturbed with idle talk, Mrs. Kettle tells the whole workroom that week, in a voice sharper than you have heard from her in years, and you understand, without needing it explained, that the warning is really about something much larger than idle talk. It is about the fear now moving through this house like the tide moves through the arches of a bridge, invisible most of the time, and then suddenly, unmistakably everywhere at once. You learn the shape of what is actually happening only in pieces, the way servants always learn things, assembled from fragments that do not fully cohere until much later. The king, by the accounts that eventually settle into something like consensus in the housekeeper's room, has become gripped by a distress none of his physicians can properly explain or treat. His mind, that quick, curious mind you once stood beside in companionable silence in the library, has begun turning against its own order, talking for hours without pause, mistaking people for others long dead, weeping without apparent cause, and then, moments later, laughing at nothing anyone else in the room can see. There are nights, you hear, when he does not sleep at all, when his voice can be heard through more than one closed door, rising and falling in a monologue that exhausts everyone forced to listen to it, and appears to exhaust him not at all. The household sphere takes a specific, practical shape you recognize, because you have spent years now understanding how this house solves problems, with linen, with schedules, with the careful management of what is seen and by whom. Rooms are prepared. Attendants are selected for discretion above all other qualities. The children, your children, the ones you've dressed and fed and comforted through years of nursery mornings, are kept away from certain wings of the house entirely, told only that their father is unwell and must rest, a phrase repeated to them so often and so carefully that even the youngest of them stops asking questions about it, in the particular unnerving way that children learn to stop asking about things that visibly frighten the adults around them. You are 20 years old that November, senior enough now in the wardrobe workroom that you're sometimes sent with linen deliveries to corridors nearer the family's private apartments than you would have been permitted to enter in your first years of service. And it is on one of these errands, an ordinary evening carrying a stack of fresh nightshirts toward a linen press near the king's own rooms, that you come closer to the centre of what is happening than you ever intend to. The corridor is dim, most of the candles unlit by order, and you move quietly out of habit rather than any deliberate stealth, your slippers soft against the boards. As you approach the press, a door along the corridor, not fully latched, swollen slightly with the season's damp the way old doors do, has drifted open perhaps 4 inches, and through that narrow gap, before you can stop yourself, before propriety or fear or simple good sense catches up with your feet, you see, The room beyond is lit by a single branch of candles, throwing more shadow than light. Two men you recognize as physicians stand near the far wall, speaking to each other in low, urgent voices you cannot fully make out. And in the centre of the room, in a plain chair drawn up close to the fire, sits the king. The same man who told you years ago not to stop your dusting on her account. The same restless, curious, gentle man you've watched pace a library and murmur to spaniels in the garden. And his wrists are bound gently but unmistakably to the arms of the chair, a length of soft cloth wound round each one, and his head is thrown back and he is talking rapidly, ceaselessly to someone who is not in the room at all, his eyes wide and bright and fixed on a point in the middle distance that holds, as far as you can tell, absolutely nothing. You do not remember afterward exactly how long you stand there. It cannot have been more than 3 or 4 seconds, the length of a single held breath, before you force your feet to move again, past the door, to the linen press, hands shaking so badly that you drop one of the nightshirts and have to kneel to retrieve it, your heart hammering hard enough that you can feel it in your own throat. You say nothing about what you saw, not to Susan, not to Joan, not to Mrs. Kettle, not to your mother in your next letter home, which you write 2 days later, and fill instead with careful, meaningless news about the weather and the price of ribbon. You have understood, without anyone needing to remind you of Mrs. Kettle's old warning from your very first morning in this house, that this is precisely the kind of thing this house eats girls who talk about. And more than that, more than fear for yourself, you understand, with a clarity that surprises you, that you do not want to be the kind of person who talks about it. Whatever else is true of the man in that chair, he was kind to a 15-year-old girl with a duster in her hand once, when he had no reason at all to be, and something in you refuses to turn that kindness, or his present suffering, into gossip to be traded below stairs for a moment's importance. But you cannot unsee it either, and for the rest of that terrible winter, every time you carry linen down that particular corridor, your whole body remembers exactly what is behind that door, whether the door is open or closed, whether the room beyond is occupied or empty, and the memory sits in your chest like a stone you have swallowed and cannot bring back up. By the first week of December, the decision is made, not by anyone below stairs, but felt by everyone below stairs the moment it happens, to move the king to Kew, the family's quieter house upriver, away from the city and its newspapers and its endless watching crowds, where a new physician, a clergyman doctor with a reputation for managing the mad that precedes him into the house like a cold draught, is to take charge of his care. The name moves through the servants' hall in whispers before you ever see the man himself, Dr. Willis. He runs, you hear, an asylum of his own in Lincolnshire, has done for years, and has a method, they say, of managing troubled minds through discipline and restraint, and a steady, unbending will that has succeeded, in his own house, with patients other physicians had given up entirely. Whether this is comfort or horror, nobody in the servants' hall can quite decide. You hear both opinions argued, sometimes by the same person within the same conversation. Relief that someone at last claims to know what to do, and a colder, quieter dread at exactly what knowing what to do might mean for a king who was, only months before, taking apart clock mechanisms on his own writing table and murmuring to spaniels in the garden. The Queen goes with him, of course, though even she, you hear, even she is kept from him for long stretches at a time by the new physician's orders, a fact that seems to distress the household nearly as much as the king's illness itself, because if the Queen herself can be kept at arm's length from her own husband's sickbed, then none of the ordinary rules anyone understood about this family's private life can be trusted to hold any more. Most of the household, your own workroom included, remains behind at the Queen's house through that winter, maintaining a residence that suddenly feels less like a home and more like a held breath. The children stay too, mostly, move between the two houses in careful stages as their parents' circumstances allow, and it falls to women like you and Susan Frere to keep their days as ordinary as such days can possibly be made. Lessons continued, meals kept regular, small kindnesses offered without explanation, because explaining feels crueler than simply being present. It is in the second week of December, with the King already gone to Kew and half the senior household gone with him, that Mrs. Kettle comes to the workroom one grey morning with a task that makes even her steady voice sound slightly strained at the edges. The rooms the King occupied during the worst weeks of his illness, the chamber where you glimpsed him bound to that chair, and the smaller closet adjoining it where he had, in calmer stretches, been permitted his books and his writing table, are to be cleared and set to rights before the family's eventual return. Linen changed, furniture restored to its proper arrangement, any signs of the sick room's recent use quietly, thoroughly erased, so that whenever this house welcomes its king home again, whether in a month or a year, he will walk into rooms that remember nothing of what happened in them. You are one of 4 sent to do the work, and you are grateful, in a way you cannot fully examine, that it is you and not some stranger who will handle whatever remains in that room, because you already know things about it that no one else on this task knows, and something in you, loyalty, perhaps, or simple human tenderness for a man who was gentle to you once when he owed you nothing, wants to be the one who touches what's left with care. The room, in daylight, without the branch of candles and the shadow they threw, looks smaller than you remembered it, and sadder. The chair is still there, drawn close to a cold hearth, and you make yourself look at it directly rather than around it, because looking away feels obscurely like a kind of cowardice you do not want to grant yourself. The lengths of soft cloth that had bound his wrists are gone already, removed by someone before you arrived, but you can see, faintly, where the chair's wooden arms have been worn pale and smooth in 2 places, rubbed by weeks of restrained hands moving against them, and your throat tightens at the sight in a way you did not expect. The closet beyond holds his writing table, and it is here, sorting through the drawers to gather up whatever papers and effects need to be returned to the family or filed away by the proper clerk, that you find it, tucked beneath a stack of ordinary correspondence, bills, notes about garden plantings, a half-finished letter to one of his ministers about a matter you do not understand and do not try to, is a single folded sheet, its paper crumpled and re-smoothed several times, as though it had been picked up and put down and picked up again by a hand that could not decide what to do with it. The writing on it is his. You have seen his hand often enough on notes left for the Queen's household to recognise the particular slant of his letters. But it's not the steady, upright hand you remember from those notes. It slopes and wanders across the page, lines running into each other, words repeated 2 and 3 times in a row as though the hand forgot, mid-sentence, that it had already written them, and threaded through the confusion again and again, the same handful of phrases returning like a tide that cannot decide whether to come in or go out. Fear of losing himself entirely, a plea addressed to no one and everyone, not to let the Queen see him as he currently is, and, near the bottom, in a hand gone suddenly, briefly steadier, as though some small clear space had opened in the storm long enough for him to write it. A single short line asking simply to be remembered, if he does not recover, as the man he was before this, and not the man this illness has made of him. You stand very still, holding that page, in a closet that smells of cold ash and old paper, and you understand, with a certainty that settles into your chest like a stone dropped into deep water, that you have just read something no one, not the physicians, not the ministers arguing in Parliament over who should govern in his place, not even, perhaps, the Queen herself, was ever meant to see. A private terror, written by a man in the one clear moment his own mind allowed him, meant for no eyes but his own, if it was meant for any eyes at all. You could hand it to Mrs. Kettle. That is what the task requires of you. Every paper found is to be gathered and passed up the proper channels, filed, accounted for, disposed of according to instructions from above that you're not privy to and have no right to question. It is the correct thing to do, the safe thing, the thing that would end this moment cleanly, and let you go back to sorting linen with your conscience entirely clear. You do not do it. You fold the paper again along its old creases, and you slide it into the inner pocket of your own apron, against your own body, and you finish the rest of the task with hands that do not shake, though your heart does not slow properly again until you are back in the wardrobe workroom that evening with the door shut behind you. You do not know in that moment what you intend to do with it. You only know, with a certainty stronger than any instruction Mrs. Kettle has ever given you, that this particular fear, written by this particular man in the one clear space his illness allowed him, does not belong on a clerk's desk to be read and filed and forgotten among bills and gardening notes. It belongs, if it belongs anywhere at all, to no one, or to him alone, whenever, if he is well enough again to want it, or to burn it himself, that night, in your garret room, by the light of a single candle you're not strictly permitted to burn so late. You read the letter through twice more, memorizing without meaning to the particular slope of certain words, and then you fold it small, smaller than it wants to fold, and you sew it with the same small exact stitches Mrs. Kettle taught you 11 years before on a length of white silk sarcenet into the lining of your own workbox, where it will stay, hidden, known only to you, for longer than you can presently imagine. You're sent 3 days after you hide the letter on an errand that takes you further from the Queen's house than you've travelled in years. A bundle of the Queen's own personal linen, items she will trust to no laundress but the ones trained in your own workroom, must be carried upriver to Kew, where she has remained at the King's side through everything. You travel by cart along the river road, wrapped in every layer of clothing you own against a December cold that bites through wool, as though it were muslin. The linen bundle held against your chest more for its own protection than any warmth it offers you, and the 2 hours of jolting, freezing travel give you more time alone with your own thoughts than you've had in months. The letter's presence at your side, a constant silent companion to every mile. Kew, when you arrive, is a smaller house than the one you know, older in places, its famous gardens, the ones the Queen has spent years helping to fill with plants gathered from every corner of a world England's ships now reach, lying dormant and skeletal under a hard frost, black branches stark against a white sky. The exotic specimens she loves so well, wrapped now in sacking and straw against the cold, tended by gardeners moving between them with the same careful, anxious attention the household inside is paying to the man at its centre. You're received not by a wardrobe woman, but by an exhausted-looking senior maid you do not recognize. Her eyes ring dark from weeks of broken sleep, who takes the linen bundle from you with a murmured thanks, and does not, this time, offer any of the ordinary pleasantries servants exchange when household staff cross paths. No question about your journey, no comment on the weather, nothing but the flat, worn courtesy of someone operating on will alone. Behind her, somewhere deep in the house, you hear it again. Fainter here than it was at the Queen's house, but unmistakably the same sound. A voice, raised, talking without pause to no one you can see, rising and falling in a register that makes the exhausted maid's shoulders tighten, almost imperceptibly before she catches herself, and smooths her face back into careful blankness. Her Majesty thanks you for the linen, the maid says, in a voice pitched carefully flat, and asks that the workroom continue exactly as before. She says, the maid hesitates, as though deciding whether this part is meant to be repeated at all, then continues anyway, perhaps simply needing herself to say it aloud to someone from outside these particular walls. She says the ordinary tasks are the only thing keeping this house standing right now. Keep doing them. That's the whole of her instruction. You carry those words back down the river road with you, turning them over the whole freezing journey home, and you understand them more deeply than you might have a year earlier, because you have by now watched an entire household prove the truth of them without anyone needing to say it aloud at all. That grief and terror, when they have nowhere else to go, can be poured, at least for a few hours at a time, into the exact steady labour of hemming a seam or counting linen, and that the counting itself becomes, in its small way, a kind of prayer. The weeks that follow are the strangest of your entire service in that house, because they teach you that a household can keep running, meal by meal, task by task, even while the ground beneath it has gone soft and uncertain in a way no one above stairs will name directly. In Parliament you hear, filtered down through footmen who have it from coachmen who overhear things at Westminster, a fight has broken out over what is to happen if the king does not recover. Whether the Prince of Wales, a young man the servants' hall regards with considerably less affection than they hold for his father, ought to be made regent, and with what powers, and for how long, and the arguments grow bitter enough that they spill from the newspapers into every coffee-house and tavern in London, and even faintly into your own workroom, where Mrs. Kettle one afternoon snaps at two undermaids arguing in whispers over which prince they'd rather see govern, telling them sharply that their opinions on the succession are worth exactly nothing, and their hemming is behind schedule. You keep working. That is what this house teaches you to do, above almost everything else. Keep working, whatever else is happening, because the linen still needs mending, and the fires still need laying, and children still need dressing in the morning whether or not their father can currently recognise his own ministers. You mend, you press. You carry the folded letter sewn into your workbox's lining everywhere you go, its presence a small constant weight against your side that you are aware of at every hour, the way you might be aware of a bruise you keep accidentally pressing. You do not tell Joan. You do not tell Susan, though Susan, sharp-eyed as ever, catches you once staring at nothing over a half-finished seam and asks gently if you are quite well, and you tell her only that you're tired, which is true, though not in the way she means it. Christmas comes and goes with none of its usual warmth. The nursery children's celebrations kept deliberately small and quiet, their father's absence explained to the youngest of them in the same careful, worn phrase. Papa is resting. Papa will see you soon. repeated so often by now that even the smallest princess has stopped believing it means what it says, though she has also, in the particular resilience of very young children, stopped asking questions about it either. January passes in a grey blur of short days and long candlelit evenings, the whole household's mood matching the weather, and it is not until the very end of February, on a morning that begins like every other morning of that long uncertain winter, that everything changes at once. You're in the workroom sorting a basket of mending when you hear it. Not a single voice but many, all at once, rising from somewhere near the front of the house, a sound your ear does not immediately recognize because you have not heard anything like it in this house for months. Cheering, real, unguarded, joyful cheering, spreading room to room faster than any single messenger could carry news, until it reaches even your workroom in the form of a breathless underfootman flinging the door open without so much as a knock. "He's himself again," the boy gasps, barely able to get the words out fast enough. "The doctors have said it. He knew the Queen. He knew his own name. He's himself again." You do not remember standing up, but you find yourself on your feet, your basket of mending forgotten on the floor, your hand pressed flat against your own chest where, beneath your apron, the folded letter still sits sewn into the lining of your workbox, and something in you that has been held tight and cold for 11 weeks finally, all at once, lets go. And you find, to your own surprise, that you are crying, standing in the middle of the wardrobe workroom with mending scattered around your feet, and you are not the only one. The recovery, once it begins, holds. Through March, the reports grow steadier, calmer, each one a little more like the ordinary bulletins of ordinary royal life that this household used to take entirely for granted. By the middle of the month, word comes that the king is to return properly to his own household, to his library, to his garden, to the wife and children who have spent nearly 3 months not knowing, day to day, whether the man they loved would come back to them whole, or ever come back to them at all. You are there, in the forecourt, among the crowd of household staff gathered to see the family's return, on the afternoon the king finally comes home. You do not expect to feel what you feel, watching his carriage draw up and the door open and the man himself step down onto the gravel, thinner than you remember him, his face marked by something the winter has clearly cost him, but upright, steady on his own feet, his eyes clear and present and fixed, the moment he sees them, on his own children running toward him across the forecourt with a lack of ceremony that no one on this one afternoon thinks to correct. He catches the youngest of them up into his arms, laughing, actually laughing, a sound you have not heard from him in longer than you realized you'd missed it. And for one unguarded moment, in front of the assembled household, he is not a king managing a kingdom's fear about his own mind. He is simply a father, home again, holding his own child, and the whole forecourt, servants and family alike, watches him do it in a silence too full for cheering. You think, standing at the edge of that crowd with your hand pressed once more unconsciously against the place where the letter still lies hidden, that you have never in your life seen relief look quite like that. Not the relief of a debt paid, or a danger passed at safe distance. The relief of watching someone you feared entirely lost come back to themselves, imperfect and thinner and marked by what they've survived, but unmistakably, gratefully, themselves again. The city itself, once the news of the king's recovery spreads beyond the household and into the streets, seems to lose its collective mind with joy in a way that mirrors, strangely, exactly what it feared in him. For days, London illuminates itself at night. Candles set in every window that can afford them. Transparencies painted with loyal mottos hung glowing in shop fronts. Bonfires at street corners. Church bells ringing at hours. No church bell has any business ringing, and you hear from footmen who venture out into it of crowds so thick along certain streets that a carriage cannot pass through them at all, everyone simply wanting apparently to be outside together, marking the strange fact of a king's mind restored to him. The formal Thanksgiving comes weeks later in April, a great public service arranged at St. Paul's Cathedral, the King and Queen to process there in state through streets that have not seen a royal procession of this scale in years. And though you're not permitted, of course, anywhere near the cathedral itself for the ceremony, you are among the household staff given leave that afternoon, once the immediate work of dressing the family for the occasion is finished, to make your own way toward the route and see what you can see from the crowd's edge, same as any other Londoner with an afternoon to spare. You go with Susan, the two of you press shoulder to shoulder into a crowd that has gathered along the route, hours before the procession is due, thick enough that you can feel the warmth of other bodies through your own gown despite the April chill, thick enough that a boy near you selling printed sheets of the day's order of service has to shout himself hoarse to be heard over the general noise, and you buy one, a penny well spent, though you do not read it, only fold it and hold it, something to do with your hands while you wait. The wait itself takes on its own rhythm, a slow building of anticipation you feel in your own chest, rising and falling with the crowd's mood, a ripple of excitement running down the street whenever a mounted officer passes, checked and calmed each time it turns out to be nothing more than an outrider clearing the way, then rising again minutes later at the next false alarm, until finally, somewhere down the line of massed bodies, a sound begins that is unmistakable, unlike any of the earlier ripples. A roar, building and rolling toward you the way you imagine a wave might build and roll toward shore. Voices catching it up street by street until it reaches you and Susan, and the whole crowd around you erupts at once, hats thrown, handkerchiefs waved, a noise so total you feel it in the ground beneath your own feet. And then he passes, close enough for one brief moment that you could almost reach out and touch the side of the state coach if you dared, which you do not, though you do the only thing that feels available to you in that instant, which is to look hard, trying to fix the sight of him in your memory the way you fix the sight of him bound to a chair 4 months earlier, needing, somehow, to overwrite one image with the other. He looks well, thinner still than before his illness, you think, but sitting upright, composed, lifting his hand now and then to acknowledge the crowd's noise, and beside him the Queen in a gown you recognise. You helped finish the hem on it yourself 3 days ago, your own stitches somewhere beneath that fabric right now, invisible, holding it together the same way they have held together every important moment of this family's public life the last 11 years. And her face, when you catch it clearly for half a second as the carriage passes, is doing something you have never once seen it do in all your years of service. It is simply, openly, without any of its usual careful composure, joyful. The bells of every church along the route have been ringing since morning, and now as the state coach passes they seem to catch each other up in a cascade that runs ahead of the procession all the way to the cathedral itself, bell answering bell until the whole sky above the street feels thick with sound. Somewhere behind you a woman is weeping openly, unashamed, dabbing at her face with a corner of her shawl, and a man beside her, a stranger to her as far as you can tell, pats her shoulder without either of them exchanging a single word, the two of them bound for this one moment by nothing more than having stood in the same crowd on the same afternoon, to watch the same relief pass by in a gilded coach. The procession moves on toward the cathedral, and the crowd around you begins slowly to disperse into smaller currents, some following the route further, some breaking off toward the taverns that will do brisk business tonight regardless of anyone's official sobriety, and you and Susan stand there a while longer in the thinning crowd, oddly reluctant to leave, as though the feeling in the street might dissolve faster than the crowd does if you stop paying attention to it. "Well," Susan says eventually, tucking a loose strand of hair back under her cap, "there's a thing I never expected to live to see. A whole city crying with joy over one man's mind coming back to him. You think, walking back toward the Queen's house through streets still hung with the previous night's illuminations, some of them burned down to guttering stubs by now, of the folded paper still sewn into the lining of your workbox, waiting there in the empty workroom for your return, and you understand, with a clarity that has been building in you slowly since the night you first hid it, exactly what you intend to do with it, and exactly why you've kept it this long, instead of simply burning it and being done with the weight of it. You're not keeping it as a trophy, or a secret to be traded for standing among the other servants, the way some might. You are keeping it, you realise, the way you would keep watch over someone sleeping. Not to use what you've seen, but simply because someone should carry it who understands what it cost him to write, and who will never let it be read carelessly, filed among garden notes and bills, by clerks who never once stood in a dim corridor and saw what that fear actually looked like on a living man's face. You never do give it back to him directly. That would require an explanation you cannot give without confessing exactly how you came to have it, and what that confession would cost you. Dismissal at the very least, and very possibly worse, is a risk you are not willing to take, not for a piece of paper, however much it has come to mean to you. Instead, years later, long after you've left service in the house altogether, married, with a household and children of your own who know nothing of the years you spent among royal linen and royal children, you take the folded, brittle paper out of the small wooden box where it has lived, move from house to house, hidden from every set of eyes but your own for nearly 3 decades, and you burn it yourself, quietly, in your own kitchen fire, one evening in the year you learn, from a newspaper brought round by your eldest son, that the king you once dusted a library beside us, girl of 15, has died, old, and by then long unwell again, in ways this time beyond any recovery, at Windsor, having outlived in the end both his own worst fears and the version of himself that wrote them down. You watch the paper catch, curl, blacken at the edges, and go at last entirely to ash, and you think, watching it, that you have kept your part of a bargain neither of you ever spoke aloud, that his fear, once glimpsed by accident in a cold closet by a frightened girl with a duster in her hand, would be carried carefully and never carried further than it needed to go. Life in the house does not stop simply because it has survived its worst winter. If anything, the years that follow feel fuller than the years before, as though the whole household, having stared for months at the possibility of losing the man at its centre, has decided, without ever discussing it directly, to live a little more warmly in the time it's been given back. You stay in service another 5 years past that April afternoon at St. Paul's, and those years pass the way the earlier ones did, in the accumulation of 10,000 ordinary mornings, except that you notice now a different quality to the ordinariness, a gratitude folded quietly into tasks that used to feel like nothing more than tasks. Mending a torn hem no longer feels like drudgery, so much as a small, steady proof that the world has gone back to needing torn hems mended rather than needing linen carried to a locked sick room. You find yourself, more than once, humming over your needlework in a way you never did in your first years in the house, and Mrs. Kettle, catching you at it one afternoon, says nothing about it at all, which from Mrs. Kettle is very nearly a blessing. Mrs. Kettle herself grows visibly older across those years. Her hands, once so steady and exacting over your own clumsy first stitches, beginning to show the same faint tremor you have watched settle into other older women's hands in service, a tremor she disguises for as long as she can by working slower and checking her own seams twice, until the day comes, in your 7th year, when she can no longer disguise it at all, and she is retired from the workroom with a small pension and a length of good black wool as a parting gift from the household. And you are, to your own surprise, one of only 3 women she permits to embrace her on the morning she leaves, holding you at arm's length afterward and telling you, in the closest thing to warmth you ever hear from her in 11 years of service, that you have good hands and a closed mouth, and that in this trade a woman could ask for worse to be said of her. You think of that sentence often in the years after, long after you've left service yourself. Good hands and a closed mouth. It is not, you come to understand, a small compliment. It is, in its way, the entire philosophy this house runs on, distilled into 6 words by a woman who spent her whole working life proving them true. Joan the laundress you lose touch with sooner, though you hear, second-hand years later, that she worked in that wash-house until her joints finally gave out entirely, and was kept on afterward, out of the housekeeper's own quiet mercy, doing lighter mending work in a warm room rather than turned out to fend for herself, the way so many worn-out servants are, and you're glad of it. Glad that this house, whatever else is true of it, took care of the woman who taught a frightened 15-year-old to rub goose grease into cracked hands, and never once ask for anything in return. Susan Frere stays in the nursery wing longer than almost anyone, moving with the family's youngest children as they grow, and by the time you leave service yourself, she's become something like a fixture of the household, spoken of by the newest nursery maids with the same slightly awed respect you once held for her yourself. Though she remains, whenever you meet her on the leads on a quiet Sunday afternoon, exactly the broad, unhurried, plainly spoken woman who laughed at your first week terror and told you the house would get its hooks into you whether you wanted it to or not. She was right, of course. You understand that most clearly on the afternoon you finally leave. You're 26 years old, and you have met through the sort of thin, unlikely thread of acquaintance that governs so much of a servant's life. A young cabinet maker named Thomas Prewitt, introduced to you by a footman's sister at a Sunday gathering you very nearly did not attend, tired as you were that particular week, and within 18 months of that first meeting you are engaged to be married, and within it too you understand that a married woman does not generally keep her place in a royal household, not in the way you have kept yours, and that the years ahead of you will belong to a different kind of household altogether, smaller, quieter, entirely your own. Thomas himself, when you finally bring him to meet the small circle of women who have shaped your entire adult life so far, passes their inspection with more grace than you expected of a man who's never before set foot near anything resembling a royal household. Joan, retired now to a warm mending room but still sharp-tongued as ever, takes one look at his hands, broad, scarred faintly across the knuckles from years of chisel work, calloused in a pattern not unlike her own, and pronounces him, with the closest thing to a compliment Joan has ever offered anyone, a man who clearly knows what real work costs. Susan simply hugs you, hard, and tells Thomas in front of you both that he had better treat you well, because you have spent 11 years learning to notice absolutely everything, and you will notice, she promises him cheerfully, the very first time he doesn't. You give your notice on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and the housekeeper who receives it, not Mrs. Kettle now, but her successor, a younger woman who was when you first arrived, only a girl a year or two above you in the workroom, thanks you for your years of good service in a tone that is formal, and yet, underneath the formality, genuinely warm, and tells you the Queen has asked, upon hearing of your departure, that you be given a small gift from her own hand, a length of the same blue silk you once spent 2 sleepless days hemming for a drawing-room gown 11 years before, folded now into a neat parcel with a short, formally worded note attached, thanking you for your faithful service to the royal household. You do not see the Queen in person to receive it. Your rank has never permitted that kind of direct farewell, and it does not now. But you hold that folded silk for a long time before you pack it into your trunk, thinking of every hour you spent over 11 years with your hands on fabric meant for her body, and never once, in all that time, exchanging more than a handful of murmured words with the woman herself, and you find that you are, despite everything Joan once warned you about not loving them, a little tearful packing it away. Your last afternoon in the house, before Thomas's cart comes to collect you in your trunk the following morning, you climb once more, alone this time, up the narrow service stair to the leads, the same door you and Susan slipped through so many Sundays before, and you stand at the parapet's edge and look out over the same view that steadied you all those years ago. The house's curved wings below you, the park beyond it, the city spreading hazy and vast past the park's edge, the cathedral's dome pale in the distance where, 5 years before, you stood in a cheering crowd and watched a king ride past thinner and older, but unmistakably, gratefully himself again. You think about the girl who arrived here 11 years ago dragging a trunk too heavy for one person, cold hands pressed flat against her own thighs to get feeling back into them before she could thread a needle. And you think about the woman standing here now, hands permanently roughened, a whole decade of this house's rhythms worn into her bones so deeply that she will, you already suspect, catch herself for years afterward instinctively counting linen, the way the Queen taught this whole household to count it, without ever quite meaning to. Susan finds you up there, unsurprised, as though she guessed exactly where you'd be on your last afternoon. Told you, she says, coming to stand beside you at the parapet, the wind pulling at both your caps the way it always does up here. Hooks in you. You'll be back, you know. Not to work, just to look at it one day, years from now, when you're passing with your own children and you want to show them where their mother spent her girlhood. You do not know, standing there, whether she is right, but you think even then that she probably is. The years after service pass differently than the years inside it did, no longer measured by Mrs. Kettle's inspections or the Queen's drawing-room calendar, but by your own children's ages, by the small cabinet-making shop you and Thomas build together near Clerkenwell, by the particular rhythm of a household that is, for the first time in your adult life, entirely your own to run as you see fit. You raise 4 children in rooms above that shop, and you find, to your quiet amusement, that Susan's prediction about the linen comes true almost exactly as she said it would. You catch yourself counting shifts and sheets by habit long after there is any royal household requiring it of you. An old discipline your hands remember even when your mind has moved on to entirely different concerns. You do go back, eventually the way Susan said you would. Not often, and never inside. Your rank never extended to visiting as a guest, and old habits of deference do not entirely leave you even after you've left service behind. But you walk your own children past the house on Sunday outings sometimes, pointing out the wing where the nursery once stood, the leads where you used to slip up on quiet afternoons, telling them, in careful, edited pieces, some small fraction of the 11 years you spent inside those walls. You never tell them about the letter. That part of the story you keep entirely to yourself, the way you kept the paper itself hidden for nearly 30 years, and by the time you finally burn it, your eldest son is a grown man with children of his own, and the girl who once stood frozen in a dim corridor watching a king's bound hands through a 4-inch gap in a swollen door has become herself an old woman, her own hands now marked less by needle calluses than by the ordinary stiffness of age. You hear the news of the king's final decline in fragments, much as you heard the earlier crisis all those decades before, through newspapers now rather than servants' hall whispers, through your grown children reading aloud from print instead of footmen breathless from running down back stairs. He had recovered. That terrible winter of 1788 and 1789 recovered well enough to reign another 2 decades, but the illness that had gripped him then had never entirely released its hold. You learn, returning again in later years with a grip that grew, each time a little harder to loosen, until by the time you're yourself a grandmother, the man you once dusted a library beside in companionable silence has been, for years, blind and largely deaf, and lost somewhere inside a mind that no longer finds its way back out, cared for by a household not unlike the one you once served in, though you will never know the names of the maids and footmen who tend him now, the way no one outside those walls ever knew your name either. He dies, in the end, in the January of a year deep into your own old age, at the country castle where he spent his final withdrawn years, and London mourns him the way it once celebrated his recovery. Bells, black cloth hung in windows where illuminations once glowed. A whole city pours in to mark the passing of a king. Most of its living inhabitants have never known as anything but a distant, silent name attached to coins and to the occasional glimpse of a shuttered royal carriage. You read the notice of his death sitting by your own fire, your grandchildren playing at your feet, and you find that what rises in you is not grief exactly. You have not seen the man himself in over 30 years, and the grief that belongs to him properly belongs to people who knew him far more closely and far more recently than you ever did. But something quieter and stranger, a kind of completion, the final closing of a door that had stood open just slightly at the back of your mind since a November evening decades before, when you saw through a 4-inch gap exactly how much a king could suffer and still be expected to rise the next morning and be a king again. That evening, after your grandchildren have gone home and your own house has gone quiet, you take the small wooden box down from its shelf, and you unfold, for the last time, a piece of paper gone brittle and soft at its old creases from 30 years of careful handling, and you read it once more by your own kitchen fire, the words as familiar to you now as your own name, the fear of losing himself entirely, the plea not to be seen as he currently was, and that one steadier line near the bottom, asking simply to be remembered as the man he had been before the illness took hold. And then you feed it gently into the flame, and you watch it catch and curl and blacken and finally entirely become part of the fire's ordinary warmth, indistinguishable from any other spent thing burning there, and you sit with your own hands folded in your lap until the last of it has gone to ash, keeping, At the very end, the same quiet, close-mouthed watch over his fear that you kept from the first frightened moment you found it. You think, sitting there in the firelight, with your hands finally empty of the weight you carried for 3 decades, of everything that house taught you in your 11 years inside it, lessons that had nothing to do with silk or seams, though they arrived disguised as exactly that. That grandeur, seen closely enough, is mostly labour. Other people's aching hands, invisible and uncounted, holding it together stitch by stitch. That the people we're taught to think of as untouchable, kings, queens, whole gilded families glimpsed only from a crowd's edge or a print shop window, carry the same fragile, frightened, entirely human insides as everyone else, and simply have more rooms and more locked doors in which to hide it. That kindness, offered once by someone who owes you nothing, can root itself in you deeply enough to shape a decision you make 30 years later, in a kitchen that man will never know existed, over a fire he will never feel the warmth of, and that a closed mouth, however small a virtue it seems standing beside courage or wit or beauty, can be, in the right hands, at the right moment, its own quiet form of love. Centuries will pass, though you cannot know that, sitting by your own small fire with the last of the ashes going cold. The house on the western edge of the park will grow larger still, rebuilt and extended by kings and queens who come long after both you and the one you served, until it becomes something grander than any duke's vanity ever imagined, its name changing from the Queen's House to something the whole world will one day recognize on sight. The gardens will be replanted a dozen times over. The library you once dusted in the grey early light will leave that house entirely, carried off to found the beginning of a great public collection that anyone, someday, servant or duke alike, will be permitted to read from freely, a thought that would have startled the restless, curious man who once told you not to stop your dusting on his account, and might, you think, have pleased him more than almost anything else that happens to his house after he is gone. But people will still rise before dawn in the dark to do work that aches in their hands by noon, will still fold fear into small, careful shapes and carry it silently rather than let it spill where it might do harm, will still in the end warm themselves at ordinary fires, having done what they could, quietly, with what they were given to carry. Some things don't change. The particular ache of hands that have worked hard all day, that doesn't change. The relief of a warm room at the end of a long one, that doesn't change either. So let it come. Let sleep take you the way it eventually took an old woman by her own kitchen fire, the last of a long-kept secret gone finally to ash, her hands folded, empty and at peace. Let the noise of the day fade the way the noise of that house once faded around a 15-year-old girl too tired to keep her eyes open past the 9th stitch. Let your thoughts slow and soften and finally, gently, stop. You've carried enough today. Whatever it was, an ordinary weight, or one you didn't choose, or simply the accumulated small labour of getting through the hours between waking and this moment, you have carried it, and now you can set it down. Somewhere, if you listen for it in the last moments before sleep takes you fully, there is still a house standing on the edge of a park, its rooms rearranged 100 times since a frightened girl first climbed its narrow back stair with cold hands and a borrowed trunk. Its corridors are full, tonight and every night, of people you will never meet, doing small, careful, unglamorous work you will never see, holding up stitch by invisible stitch some larger thing they may never fully understand the shape of. You do not have to hold anything else tonight. Let it go. Good night.